David Ives.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I feel I have arrived finally. Getting to speak at the Anthro Club luncheon is quite the honor. I feel like I am somebody, I tell myself now. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm here to talk about 2008 election. The title on the flyers does not match the one on the screen, but that's okay. I couldn't remember what I put on the flyers originally, so that's why this is up here. But Indiana matters, doesn't it? That's kind of the question we have here. So we're going to talk about the presidential primary, but not just the presidential election itself. We're actually going to start by talking about what's on the ballot. Because for a lot of people, the only thing they've been paying attention to is just that, the fact that there's a presidential election going on. Obviously, we have that going on. Technically, we're electing folks to a convention. We're not actually electing or nominating a president right now. And we're also going to be electing or nominating people to run for House of Representatives. If you look around the state, there are several contested races on that front as well. A lot of people don't realize that. Republicans actually have 6 of the 9 House races are contested in the primary. Democrats have 3 that are contested out of the 9. So there's some excitement there as well. Then when we look at the state level, we actually have a governor's race contested on the Democratic side as well. Normally, this would be the marquee race, this election, but given a little something else that's going on here, people have sort of forgotten about the governor's race, but it's still going on. Later on, or I should also say right now, we're looking at nominating half of our state senators. The Indiana State Senate has 50 members. Half of them, they all serve for 4-year terms, and half of them are up every 2 years. As far as this part of the state is concerned, we really only have districts 12, 13, and 16 that are up. And by the way, this contested one on the Republican side, that's because the incumbent is retiring. Almost everybody who is serving in their capacity is uncontested in a primary, but there's a little excitement there because he's stepping down. On the state rep side, all of our state reps are up for election every 2 years, every single one of them, 100 of them throughout the state. And in this case, in this area up here, there are 2 that are contested, 50 and 85, which are sort of interesting in and of themselves. 85 might be a little more interesting. That's Phyllis Pond, who's been in the legislature for quite some time. And she has one rather well-known, a gentleman named Warman, who's run before. And then perhaps more importantly, Bob Lee, who is currently the county treasurer, and Allen County is also seeking that nomination. He was term limited out of the treasurer's office, so he's seeking another office. And most of you know his name because you see it on your property tax bill when it shows up. It's some of the worst political advertising that ever existed, but nonetheless, that's what happens there. By the way, let me jump back up here to state senators very quickly. What's interesting about that number 13 is the incumbent, after signing up to run, has now decided that his health may keep him from running. He might actually be stepping down. So don't you wish you were running in that primary as the underdog because you'd now be in line to win, but that's not going to happen. And then we'll, of course, be electing delegates to the state convention, and down there is where those folks, the people who are at the state convention, will actually be nominating lieutenant governor, superintendent of public instruction, and attorney general. So that's what's on the ballot right now from a federal and a state standpoint. Some very important positions in play here, but a lot of people don't realize they're all on there. Let's go a step further and actually talk about local races, county races. In this case, what we're looking at, these are just for Allen County since that's where we're sitting, but you'll find similar races in other counties. Allen County Commissioner's race, not contested on either side. In fact, Democrats don't even have anyone running for the nomination right now. Allen County Council at Large, there are 6 people seeking the 3 seats on the Republican side, only 1 person seeking the 3 seats on the Democratic side. But I'm sure the Democrats will eventually name people to that ballot as well. County coroner is up for election. The incumbent is running again. He's uncontested, and there's no Democrat running against him right now. We also have the county surveyor, which is actually a contested race on the Republican side. Now, all of you are saying, wow, I had no idea we elected that position. Let alone it's exciting enough that 2 people want it. Yes, believe it or not, it actually is. This position is relatively important because it deals with development in the county, where new subdivisions are going to go, where new construction sites are going to go for businesses, etc. County surveyor ends up playing a pretty big role in stormwater management, so it's a pretty influential position. County treasurer, once again, Bob Lee, who is term limited out. One of his deputies is running for the Republican nomination unopposed, but on the Democratic side, there are 2 people seeking that position. You get to invest millions of dollars every year. It sounds very exciting. maybe not as exciting as it sounds. And then for 3 of the 4 school corporations in Allen County, there are school board elections, not nominations, but actual elections. They're all nonpartisan races, but for Northwest Allen, East Allen, Southwest Allen, they actually elect their school board members in a primary, or during the primary election. Floyd Community Schools, they elect theirs during the fall. We'll see them on the ballot this coming fall. But this is what's on there from a local government standpoint. Some of the races, not particularly exciting. If you're a Democrat, you don't even have to worry about the first 2, as long as the one person running for county council at large votes for herself, and I'm under the impression she's going to, she'll win. And then, coroner, not exciting on either side. Treasurer, exciting on one side. Surveyor on the other side. School board, though, brings out a lot of passionate people when it comes to elections, local elections. But what's interesting is that this is during the primary election, and if you didn't know this already, primary elections is when we have our lowest turnout. And so one of the recommendations that was made by the Kernan-Shepard Commission was to move all school board elections to November, when there is higher turnout, therefore more people participating. We'll see what comes from that. But this is what's on the ballot. Thought you might want to know about that. Now, of course, we jump back to the presidential level because this is what everybody's really excited about. And everybody keeps talking about Indiana and North Carolina on May 6th. I want to make sure that people don't forget Guam on May 3rd. That's an exciting race right there. Those 4 delegates that are at stake, that's going to make the difference, perhaps. A week after us, we see West Virginia, and then a week after that, Kentucky and Oregon. What's kind of interesting about this is the number of delegates remaining. The number in parentheses are the number of delegates in each state. And if you have not been paying attention to the Democratic nomination, you need a PhD in some bizarre science in order to understand the delegate allocation policy. For example, North Carolina is really not that much bigger than Indiana, but they have a whole lot more delegates. That's because it's a more democratically leaning state. It's just a strange way to allocate things, but it seems to work for them. Oh, wait a minute, maybe it doesn't work for them. Usually works for them. We'll see what happens. Right now, if we looked at those pledged delegates, and these numbers here are pledged delegates, in other words, on the first ballot at the convention, you're going to vote the way you're told to vote. There's no sort of maneuvering around that. If we look at the projected pledged delegates right now, Clinton is sitting at about 1,330. Obama is sitting at about 1,490. And I say projected because it's actually kind of hard to determine the exact number. The system gets so confusing in some states, for example, Texas, where they actually hold a primary election and do a caucus too, because apparently it's not bad enough to make people vote once. They make you do it twice there in Texas. So it's kind of hard to actually calculate the exact number. I'm using New York Times estimates for these, but you can find other estimates that will change those numbers up and down. And then, of course, there is the subject everyone loves to talk about right now, superdelegates. Superdelegates were an invention the Democrats came up with in the early 1970s. They were supposed to be a safety valve. See, Democrats wanted to suddenly get regular people involved in the process. They wanted regular people having their say in who should get the nomination. And then they thought to themselves, but we really don't want regular people to have complete say because they could pick a crazy person who would not get elected in the fall. So they created this concept of superdelegates. Superdelegates are there as a safety valve. Now, of course, a lot of the superdelegates weren't old enough to vote back in the 70s when these positions were created, and they're kind of confused as to what their role is right now. But they're supposed to be the safety valve, and they'll all figure it out eventually. Clinton has 266, Obama 240. Actually, I should have adjusted that this morning. I apologize. It would be 267 and 241. They each picked up one yesterday. Unknown, about 225, 224, unknown. These are people who've not yet said which way they're going. And by the way, superdelegates, they can make up their mind at any moment. They could all tomorrow hold a press conference and say, this is the way we're voting. They could wait until the convention, say this is the way we're voting. They can do whatever they want. They can change their mind. I'm for Clinton. I'm for Obama. I'm for Clinton. I'm for Obama. It just depends on how much attention they want, apparently. Indiana has 11 of these. You'll hear some people say we have 12. We used to have 12. One of our superdelegates was a guy named Joe Andrew, who at one point in time was the chair of the Indiana Democratic Party. But he has moved away from the state of Indiana, and his superdelegate has gone with him. So we only have 11. Here they are right now in their current allocation. Clinton has 4 of them. Those are the last names of people who've committed to her. Obama has 3, and then there are 4 who are not yet known. And I want to point out these first 3 here, they happen to be alphabetical, which is handy. But those first three are the three Democrats who defeated Republican incumbents in 2006. One of them in a relatively close race, for example, Barron Hill defeated the guy who defeated him in 2004, and they're going to be facing off again this year. So they're actually going at it for the fourth time this time around. He's got to be careful. He's got to be cautious, do what his people suggest. Joe Donnelly is from the South Bend area, north central part of the state. Brad Ellsworth, the southwestern part. Hill, the southeastern part. And Pete Visclosky from the northwest part. Now, those first three defeated incumbents, they know they're going to be targeted this time around, so they have to be careful about what they're doing. Visclosky, though, he's in about as safe a seat as you can get in. He's a Democrat representing the region, as we like to call it, Gary, East Chicago, etc. And he's not committed one way or the other yet either, which is sort of interesting. We'll get to hear from him later on. But if you add together those totals, you'll see that Clinton is sitting at about 1,600, Obama about 1,730, little bit of a lead. Now, if you are a high-level geek, you'll be interested in what I'm about to show you. There is this fabulous thing on CNN's website called the Superdelegate Game. They actually call it the game. You just go to Google and type in CNN Superdelegate Counter Game, and it'll be the first thing that comes up. But take a look at this. You can actually pick how each one's going to do. So in Guam, if I think they're going to break even at 50%, I just click on it, and suddenly they both go up. If I pick on Indiana and I say, since the poll that the Mike Down Center did showed Obama winning by a little bit, I'll throw a little bit his way. And you can see the numbers normally would be adjusting over here. It's not working right now for some reason. But as you add the delegates in, these go up. And if you did this math, you would find out that basically it is not possible for either of them to get the nomination through pledged delegates. It's basically not mathematically possible for that to happen, which is disconcerting to some and comforting to others. So when people say, oh, well, if Clinton loses Indiana, she should get out of the race, there's really no incentive for her to get out of the race. Because the folks down here, and what I like about this screen is the superdelegate bar down here. When they first put up the game, the superdelegate bar was kind of small. But as the election has gone on and the importance of superdelegates has increased, so has the size of their bar, which I find interesting. I don't know if they did it on purpose, but I find it amusing that they've done it that way. One of the things that I include in this presentation are the actual URLs for a number of resources. Go and play the game yourself. We know that Clinton is probably going to win Obama's probably going to win North Carolina. It is, some people think, a little more likely that Clinton will win Indiana. And if we go through those states, there are some that you can basically say fall into one camp or the other, which makes the likelihood of pledged delegates being the route one of them is going to get the nomination even less likely. So, like I said, it's a game for people who apparently have nothing else to do with their lives but play political games. So, that's where we stand right now. And for a lot of people, they're thinking this is great. There's going to be this huge turnout, lots of excitement. But first, we should actually talk a little bit about what we mean by an open or closed primary. If you've watched a lot of television lately, you've heard the talking heads and the pundits talk about Indiana's open primary law. And I am here to actually correct every news outlet in the country right now. Indiana does not have an open primary law. An open primary means that your eligible voters do not need to be registered as one thing or the other. A closed primary, you actually, when you sign up, you say, I am a Republican or I am a Democrat. Indiana has something that's kind of modified. It's kind of in the middle. When you go in to vote, you are supposed to request the ballot for a particular party. And when you get that, that's how you're supposed to vote in that party. And you are wondering to yourselves, well, but can I just request either one? Which is a very good question. And that's why I've included some of the Indiana code here for your perusal, because I like to back myself up with facts and law when I can. Indiana law says that you are supposed to vote in the primary of the party for which you cast the most votes in November 2006, the last general election. So you have to ask yourself, think back. In November of 2006, did I cast more votes for Republicans or Democrats? And if you cast more votes for Republicans, you're supposed to vote in the Republican primary. If you cast more votes for Democrats, you're supposed to vote in the Democratic primary. Now, some of you are thinking to yourself, I didn't vote at all, so it doesn't matter. Well, the code has a provision for that as well. If you did not vote in the last general election, then what you're supposed to do is vote in the primary of the party for which you anticipate casting the most votes this fall. Okay, so now you're all thinking about this a little bit, you're maybe changing your strategies a little bit, and you're thinking to yourself, well, what happens if the person in front of me is trying to ask for the wrong ballot and I know they're lying about it? Oh, what can we do about that? Well, you can actually challenge a voter. If you are a valid voter, if you are supposed to be participating in that primary election, you can actually say, he's not a Democrat, he's a Republican, I challenge him, or she's not a Republican, she's a Democrat, I challenge her. You have to be a voter with standing, someone who could participate in that primary, so you have to be a member of that party. And then here's where it gets fun. Because this is the government, there is paperwork to fill out. There's a form, and the person who is challenging just has to fill out the form, has to write down, I don't think this person should be allowed to vote because in the last election, I think they voted for more Republicans or Democrats. Now, you're starting to notice a small flaw here, but suspend that reality for just a moment, if you would, please. So after you have challenged this voter, then the voter will be handed the same piece of paper, except it'll be turned over. And on the backside, all they have to write down is, yeah, I am. That's basically it. They have to say, yeah, I did vote for more Democrats than Republicans in 2006, therefore I get to vote in the Democratic primary in 2008. Or they could say, I didn't vote in 2006, but I plan to vote for more Democrats than Republicans in 2008, therefore I get to participate in the primary. Now let's stop suspending reality for a moment and get to the real crux of the problem. Can anyone determine exactly how another person voted in an election? Now, that's one of the beauties of the secret ballot. So after all of this, after all of these theatrics of someone challenging another person and the bureaucratic element of filling out a piece of paper, do you know what we do with those voters? We let them vote anyway. We let them vote anyway. We don't make them vote a provisional ballot. We don't make them vote on an emergency ballot. They just walk up to the machine the same way you will seconds later when you have not been challenged and you vote on the exact same machine, the vote gets counted. But that's what the law says. This is what the law says. This is what we are supposed to do.
When did this law get written and what were they thinking? This had to be passed by the legislature and the governor had to sign it. So
yeah, this has actually been on the books for a long time. This is not new legislation, and in many respects it is a compromise. It's a compromise. That's maybe the best way to start describing it. When it comes to voting, believe it or not, most folks are honest. Most folks are honest. If you tell them what the law says, I mean, think about it. When you're driving at night, at midnight, and nobody's around and you come to a red light, most of us actually stop at the red light, don't we? Some of us stop at the red light, look to the right, look to the left, and then proceed through the intersection, but we at least stop for a moment, right? Most folks are law-abiding.
Well, the ballot secret, how do we know that most people are honest about it?
Well, we don't, do we? There's no way, absolutely no way to check this, but if you watch the making of laws long enough, what you'll realize is there is a lot of nonsense that takes place, but it's what's negotiated out. Here, somebody, if they want to challenge a voter, they have a rational basis for doing so. They have a legal basis for challenging. Can't really amount to anything. And quite frankly, some folks, if you challenge them, they will immediately say, oh, never mind, I'm not going to do it. Because they won't have thought all the way through. They'll say, okay, I've been challenged, I won't vote. I won't vote in that primary. I'll just walk away or I'll ask for the other ballot. So it works and it doesn't work, like a lot of things.
I mean, it's interesting ethically in that it's essentially an honor system. I mean, the law is constructed in a way that all the people involved
Yeah, it really is.
would basically know this is what we're telling the people to do, and you have to. I mean,
Yeah.
it's essentially a clear guidelines, but the ultimate enforcement.
Now, let's actually take this a step further. While it isn't based on ethics and your own willingness to be a law-abiding person, let's think about this for a second, just go a step further. We know from research that, first of all, people over-report their incidents of voting. If we go look at the national election studies and we look up how many people say they participated in the 2004 election, it is far above what we know actually participated if we just look at turnout. People have a tendency to sort of reconstruct reality. And they have a tendency to reconstruct reality in terms of who they think they supported. So if you look at a close race and then go do a general population survey like a year later and ask, so did you vote for X or Y? Remarkably, the winner usually will have won by a much wider margin than we know was the fact during the actual election, because people like to say they backed the winner. So ask yourself, can you remember what was even on the ballot in 2006? And be honest with yourself. Can you remember what was on the ballot in 2006? And if you can you remember what your vote was in every one of those instances? I mean, I didn't walk out with a little checklist for myself that I've kept for this election so I can look back and say, I'm supposed to vote in this primary or that primary. Additionally, if you live in a place that's extremely uncompetitive, it's possible that although you are a card-carrying member of a party, when you got to the polls, there were uncontested races, and you ended up voting for a majority of people from the other party because you voted in every race, which of course is not the way what the law is supposed to be doing. Of course, all this problem comes from the fact that primaries are party functions. They're not governmental functions. Government is administering a party function. Our tax dollars are paying for the parties to decide who their nominees are. Well, when it comes to this idea of crossing over, because that's been a lot of the discussion here, we call it strategic voting or crossover voting, and we ask, well, why would people do this? And there are two reasons people want to cross over. They want to cross over, one, because they want to try and choose the best alternative. In other words, they're happy with their nominee, but they look at the other party and they say, boy, I really like this person better. So they cross over to vote in that primary, try and get that person the nomination, so that in the fall, they're basically choosing between two people they can live with, as opposed to one they can live with and one they can't stand. The other reason people will cross over is for what we refer to as rating. You go over and try and get the weaker candidate the nomination so that your candidate is more likely to win. So these are the reasons that people cross over vote. And how would you go about coordinating this? Well, it's simple on paper. You find a group of people willing to cross over. That might be easy to do. You agree on which candidate to support. That might be complicated. And then you just get everybody to go vote. So let's take the 2008 situation here. Republicans, they've maybe found a group of people who say, yes, I'm willing to cross over and vote. And so we get to the second step, which candidate should we support? And then some are going to say, well, Clinton, clearly, because the Republican base will come out en masse to vote against her. It's going to be easier to defeat her in the fall. And people will say, oh, that makes sense. And then someone else will go say, no, Obama. Because if you look at polling results, you'll see that Obama has consistently been able to draw independents and what we call soft Rs, or Republican-leaning independents, his way. And they're thinking, now I like the second best option. I don't want the worst of the two candidates in there on the offhand chance she wins. I don't want to take that risk. So you actually get people working at sort of cross purposes. You cannot get people to agree on who is the easier candidate to defeat, nor who is the better of the two, because there are a lot of variables at play here. So does it work? Well, scholarly research has shown that it doesn't really work. It doesn't usually have an effect on the outcome of the election, although people have tried to do it. In fact, in 2002, we know there was strategic voting that took place here in Allen County. In 2002, for those of you who don't remember, former Fort Wayne Mayor Paul Helmke took on Congressman Mark Souder in the Republican primary, and there were a lot of Democrats, in this case, Democrats who said, wait a minute, this is a no-brainer. It's not electing the weaker candidate. This is going for our second best alternative. Helmke was viewed as much more moderate than Souder. They said, let's go get him. Let's get him the nomination, because then we can live with him better than we can live with Souder. There was a fairly uniform set of understanding there. Unlike the case with Clinton and Obama, where people can't really decide which way to go, that was easy. In case you didn't notice, it didn't work. It didn't work. You still had like 3,300, maybe 400 people who showed up and did this. It still didn't change the outcome of the election. In the case of this election, people who cross over for Clinton and Obama, it will probably balance itself out. Maybe lean a little bit more towards Obama, but there's no guarantee of that. Why doesn't it work? Well, I've mentioned these already. You can't find enough people to do it. That was the problem in 2002. Can't agree on which strategy to pursue, which of course is true. And then there's this interesting thing that gets back to the whole issue of morals and your own personal self, can you live for a year with the wrong letter next to your name? Because that's public record. We actually, Mike Wolf and I, political science department, we did some studying on this. We actually spoke with people who did cross over in '02. One person, she was deathly afraid that she would die before the primary of 2003 with the wrong letter next to her name. She just couldn't fathom that going on. And think of this, oh my goodness, we have no elections in 2009. So you have to make it all the way to 2010 in order to not have that letter next to your name. That will drive even some more people away from it because they don't think they can live more than a year. You know, these are part of the reasons that this doesn't work all that well. So who's going to win in Indiana, you're asking me. We did some polling over at the Mike Downs Center, and we asked people what's the most important issue facing the United States, what's the most important issue facing Indiana. For those of you who are not good at reading polling data, it's the economy. It's the economy. It's the economy. When 40% of a population says it's the economy, probably the economy. If you look on the United States level, Iraq at 14%, healthcare at 12%, and quite frankly, those two issues, depending on how you word them, could become economic issues anyway, right? Can't afford healthcare, we can't afford government programs because of the money going into the war in Iraq. In Indiana, 48% of the people said the economy. That's a huge number. There is no doubt what the issue is here. The second issue, property taxes, but I thought we just took care of property taxes. Oh, well, maybe we haven't yet. And maybe we can hear more from candidates about how they're going to fix property taxes for us. Immigration at 10%, and in part because one of my colleagues is here and I know how much he loves this issue, I'm going to make a point of telling you all that coming in at a whopping 5% of our respondents said the number one issue that should be faced in Indiana ahead of all other issues, daylight saving time. Daylight saving time. It will not go away. It's the gift that keeps on giving. If you don't have a position on that issue, it's just fun for years to come. By the way, young people moving away, only 5% of the respondents are worried about that. Apparently we're okay with all the young people moving away, or at least a bunch of us are. In Indiana, is it heading in the right direction or has it gotten off on the wrong track? Well, 40% say right direction, 51% say wrong track. If you are an incumbent running for office, that's bad news. That's bad news. Because it means that over half of the people think that what you have been doing is not going the way it should be going. I'm not saying you have to have over half of them liking the direction you're heading in, but that's bad news for an incumbent. So we asked people on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the most negative feelings you could ever have, 5 being completely neutral, and 10, you would do whatever you could for these people. We asked people to rate the 3 top candidates. You see John McCain at 5.2, Hillary Clinton at 4.5, Barack Obama at 4.9. That's not a whole lot of difference between them, quite frankly. Nobody is far and away the more popular or most popular of the candidates here. And then, just for kicks, we asked them to rate the performance of 2 people. We asked them to rate the performance of George Bush. By the way, the scale this time, 1 meant, and this is actually the way we worded it, doing the job worse than anyone ever could. 10, doing a better job than anyone ever could. And believe it or not, there are people who chose both 1 and 10. For the current president, George W. Bush, 4.1 was his score. The current governor, 5.4. So the governor had to be thinking to himself, hey, at least I'm not the president. But still, that's not all that positive a rating when it comes right down to it. So let's take a look at what the polling data says. I went out and I found as many polls as I could to see what the results say. And as you can see, well, there's a clear trend here, isn't there? I was really hoping that someone would show me what the trend was. This is incredibly interesting. You have same providers. You know, when people do polls, sometimes they do them in-house, sometimes they'll hire a vendor to do them. You have the same provider in a couple of instances up here doing a survey on 3 days, the next 3 days doing another survey for another client with just slightly different methodologies, showing each of them winning. This is fascinating. It's a shame I'm not teaching a methods class right now. My students would hate survey research by the end of it, but they would understand the crapshoot that survey research actually is. We see here that either one might be ahead, And if we just focus on the last four surveys, which all came out basically this week, one of them a little late last week, last four surveys, 2 say Clinton, 2 say Obama. Now, what's interesting is that when Clinton is ahead, she's usually ahead by a wider margin than Obama is. And so even though our poll, the one we did, showed Obama up by 5 points, I think when you look at all of this data, I think she's probably ahead, but just by a little bit, not by a lot. Now, obviously, North Carolina, Indiana, it's a sort of a foregone conclusion that Obama's going to win in North Carolina. The last 4 surveys there, all done this week, I should say. They all show him ahead by double digits except one. Every other poll shows him ahead by at least 10 points, 11 points. In one case, 13 points, I think was the biggest margin there. He's going to win that. She knows that, so she's not going to spend a lot of time there. If you've looked, who's been visiting Indiana more? Clinton has, because she knows this is the one she has to take. But even if she loses by just a fraction, 51-49, they'll walk out of here with almost the exact same number of delegates. Neither one really ahead by that much. So that's the way I'm interpreting this data. And there's another factor in here. Not only are there methodological differences that could be discussed, some of them significant. When it comes to polling, obviously you want to make sure you're talking to those who are going to vote. So what's the best way to find them? Some people say you do a random digit dial. You literally throw every person into the pool and you call them and you ask them, are you registered to vote or not? Are you registered to vote or not? If they say yes, then you ask them, are you likely to vote or not? And then you ask them the question. Other people say no. You start with the voter registration base because you know they're registered to vote. You don't have to ask that first question. You just ask them if they're going to vote. Those are 2 of the differences that exist in in the polls provided by the same provider, done by the same vendor. So there are methodological issues to discuss. But then Indiana is just not used to this. We haven't had this kind of attention since 1968. I would hazard to guess, yes, most of you were not alive then. And those of us who were, some of us really weren't paying attention to politics back then, let's just say. So we haven't had this kind of attention since 1968. And unlike in Iowa and New Hampshire and even South Carolina, where the pollsters have developed their methodologies, they know what has worked in the past, they can apply the same methodology again, we're new territory. And so there could be questions about which methodology really is the best methodology for the state. Also, we're not used to television commercials. We're not used to speaking engagements. We're not used to direct mail. I know a house that got 3 pieces of mail on the same day. 2 from one campaign, 1 from the other campaign. Not the best mailing program, by the way, from a campaigning standpoint, but we're not used to this. And so it could be that while a number of us, in fact, according to the poll that Mike and I did, 60% plus of Clinton supporters said they've been backing her from the beginning. 50% plus of Obama supporters said they have been backing him from the beginning. In other words, once they made a decision, they have stuck with those people. But it could be that people are suddenly saying, well, maybe I should take some time. Maybe I should try to figure this out. Maybe I should think about it a little bit longer before I commit to something, because now, for the first time ever, I can actually go hear them speak. I can see their commercials. I can get their direct mail. All right, that governor's race that I told you normally would be the marquee thing that most people are ignoring now, well, let's talk about that for a second. Here, there is a bit more of a trend. By the way, this poll right here, a lot of you might not know this, but polls are wrong 1 time out of 20, just because. I think that's the 1 time out of 20, by the way. But if you look here, there is one very consistent thing, and that's that Jill Long Thompson is ahead of Jim Schellinger consistently. Consistently, with the exception of that one blip, she is ahead. That is probably where this one will end up. This has been, even when those polls have been showing differences between Clinton and Obama, they've been very consistent on the Thompson-Schellinger race. It's been very consistent. So this one I'm a little more comfortable with. Not hugely comfortable with, but a little more comfortable with it. Now, in case you're wondering what would happen this fall, because you are a strategic voter who wants to make sure that, that Indiana matters for more than just May, well, not looking so good for you. Because we asked, how about McCain versus Clinton? We asked this of not just Democrats, but voters in general. We said McCain versus Clinton. 53% said McCain, 42% said Clinton. Not looking very good for her there. And then we said, well, how about McCain-Obama? 51-44. And there are some folks who say, hey, wait a minute, that's close. That's close enough that maybe something should go on here. Maybe we should have some sort of race here. And clearly there are two different strategies that could be pursued based on the demographic trends that we see, or the demographic variables we see between those two. Let's move down to the governor's race. Daniels versus Schellinger, 47-46. Daniels versus Jill Long Thompson, 48-47. 1 point difference each time. And what is fascinating about these two, it doesn't matter which demographic category you look at, age, party affiliation, gender, how often someone goes to church, education, it could be either Schellinger or Thompson. Doesn't matter. This is a referendum election for Mitch Daniels. That what he has to worry about is being the person everyone wants to get rid of, or a good chunk of them want to get rid of, because it is so consistent between these two competitors. We'll have to wait and see what happens there, but that's something for November, and of course could change between now and then. Well, if you are into politics, I have a few suggestions for you, some places you might want to go visit. First of all, Real Clear Politics does a nice job of summarizing all the polls that are out there. So if you are a junkie and you want to see every one of those polls I posted up here, go to Real Clear Politics. That's the URL for it. If you don't like Real Clear Politics, that's fine. Go to pollster.com. Real Clear does a nice average. It actually figures out an average of all the polls, trying to help us get rid of those outliers a little bit. Pollster shows this nice graphic trend of the two, which is interesting. And if you haven't made up your mind yet, and I know not everyone has, well, here are three websites for you. Project VoteSmart has been around for a long time, viewed as one of sort of the most objective, nonpartisan bodies you can go to for information about candidates. But quite frankly, the candidates aren't so good at responding to their requests for information. Just a quick point of reference there. And then the next two, VoteHelp and SelectSmart, you can actually go and take a quiz in each case. Sometimes the quiz is a little longer if you want to keep going, a little shorter if you want. What these folks have done is actually looked through the policy positions of the candidates, the major presidential candidates, and actually charted them out. So when you're answering a question, what's your solution to Iraq? Is it to withdraw immediately, set a timetable, stay there forever? And you answer that. And how important is that issue to you? Very important, not very important, somewhere in between. You can actually, just little radio buttons, you click on them, and before you know it, they will actually spit up in front of you the percentage with which you agree with candidates, which is actually kind of cool. And I've actually, when people call me up, they say, I'm not sure, who should I go for? I always tell them, go read their websites, go read news coverage. And then I say, and by the way, you might want to go check these things out. Because after you read the news coverage, people, still, they're not quite sure because they don't quite understand the issues. I've had people call me back who will tell me how upset they are because they scored with Clinton like a 94.5 and with Obama a 94.4. And suddenly they're trying to figure out what the difference could be, and if they take it again, will it really be the exact same thing, and are there other variables they should be looking at? So, but these are they're fun if nothing else, and mildly informative. And then a few more resources for you. If you're wondering who those folks are running at the local level, you want to see the ballot itself, go to Allen County Election Board. That's an insanely long URL. Just go to Google and type in Allen County Election Board. If you want to see a list of federal and state candidates, you just have to go down to the Secretary of State's website. That's in.gov. In case you can't remember, just check an old license plate. You'll remember that. in.gov/SOS/elections. Fairly easy. You'll find those list of candidates there. And then, in case you're wondering what the rest of the schedule is, the National Association of Secretaries of State, NASS.org. You can go there to see not only what the rules are, what the schedule is, but also voter registration deadlines and things like that. Very helpful website. The delegate counter game, which I already showed to you. And then summary of primaries and caucuses to date. How has each of them done in each race, which may help you decide. Maybe you're trying to pick the one you think can win in the fall or the one who's less likely to win in the fall. Looking at their track record might help you out. This is New York Times. They've done a very nice job of covering things. And then superdelegates. New York Times has this great thing. It's a whole page devoted to the superdelegates. You can look at them by state. And when you bring up an individual state, it will show the Clinton column, the Obama column, the undecided column. And then they'll have little quotes under them too. This is why I'm supporting so-and-so, or this is why I haven't made up my mind yet. And so you can see who these people actually are and maybe get to know a little something about them. So that is your very quick introduction to the 2008 primary. If there are questions, I would be happy to answer them.
I was a little surprised to see that McCain's over 10 points above either Obama and Clinton, if I read that right.
Actually, you did not.
Oh.
11-7.
What you will find if you look, and this is something we've seen in every other state, Obama does have a tendency to pull independents and soft Rs or Republican-leaning independents his way. And so that's where you see the big difference here. Hillary has solid support behind the strong Democrats and opposition among the Republicans, and it's the independents that are that flexible there.
Given the negativities of the Republican Party these days, is it because they're going after each other and not after McCain? Is it too early for this to matter?
No. In some respects, the demographic groups supporting Hillary are the same groups that have been supporting her all along, and the groups supporting Obama are the same groups that have been supporting him all along. The dynamic will obviously change after we know who the nominee is. Right here first.
Two
In there.
questions.
Yes.
One is about Iowa and New Hampshire. Don't they have in their state constitutions that they always have to go first? And how did we go about getting it to where they make pretty much the decisions for the rest of the Americans? And also, what are they going to do about Michigan and Florida and stopping the problem of people moving their primaries ahead of when they're supposed to be? How are they going to fix that in the next election? I mean, those are two huge problems that are affecting this primary majorly.
And the answer is, who knows? That's the short answer. That's the honest answer, too. I mean, I'll speculate a little bit. People have always wanted to move forward because they want to be one of those states that matter, which makes sense. And quite frankly, who would have thought being the last state could matter, or one of the last states could matter, but that's the case this year. And that may encourage some people to not move forward, because they'll say, hey, look, if that freakish thing that happened in 08 happens again, we'll be okay. But everybody wants to be in the front because you get more visits. If you watch C-SPAN before Iowa, before New Hampshire, I mean, there were presidential candidates sitting in people's living rooms and being asked questions like, in Iowa, this is the most important issue, what will you do to fix it? And they had to address questions specific to Iowa. That's why everybody wants to move up. But that creates a real problem. We get to the point where suddenly you need so much money because there is such a front-end loading. I mean, Super Tuesday, what was it, 24 states participating that day, or 20 states participating that day? It's almost impossible to compete in all those states without a massive war chest. So in some respects, it's counter to what we want to let everybody front-end load. But the goal was to have everything decided so early that they could spend the rest of the year bashing the other side. It just clearly didn't work out all that well. And they'll have to figure something out, at least on the Democratic side. One of the reasons it was easier to see on the Republican side who the nominee would be was because they're winner-take-all states almost, every one of them. So when you win, who cares if you only got 50% plus one vote? You got all the delegates. That obviously clears up the mess quite a bit. So what are they going to do about Florida and Michigan? That's a really big I don't know. You've heard both camps already making arguments. Some say, hey, seat some delegates and then let us argue in front of them at the convention, which is a very interesting proposition. Some say, don't worry about it and just count what's there and we just give the nomination to the person with the most delegates. Someone else says, no, if you can't get to 2025, then it's the largest popular vote. They don't know what they're going to do yet. And there is a real power struggle going on right now over exactly what to do. Here and then to the back. Yes?
Well, I just wanted to clarify, these numbers are just for Indiana, right?
Just for Indiana, yes.
Okay.
Okay, in the back. Yes?
I wanted that clarification, but also, are there national polls that give those? I'm sure there are. Do you know what the numbers
Well, there are national polls, and as I always like to say, national polls don't mean diddly when it comes to the presidential election because of the Electoral College. So, I mean, I don't care what a national poll says. Tell me what it says in New Hampshire, New Mexico, and Iowa, because those are states that flipped from 2000 to 2004. Tell me what they say in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, Michigan, traditional battleground states. That's what really matters. And if you go to pollster.com or Real Clear Politics, they actually have those numbers you can see.
Are you familiar with Google Trends?
Google Trends, I'm afraid I'm not.
It's kind of an unadvertised service that Google has. What you can do is you can enter in two search criteria, and then what it will do is it'll give you a comparison of the number of hits for those two. And also, so it'll give you a graph comparison of hits between versus those two, and then also it will show you in the lower field media coverage on those two. And what I thought was kind of interesting was, and this was a guy who was obviously a Ron Paul supporter, but what was interesting in the video that I saw was the number of hits that Ron Paul was getting was far and away above those of McCain, Clinton, or Obama, in absence of any media coverage, and not until there was a spike in media coverage did those numbers tend to even out with Ron Paul. It was kind of interesting, something you might want to check out.
Yeah, the internet effect is very interesting just between 2004 and this year, 2000. I mean, you go back to 96 and who cared about internet at the time? But those sorts of things are always something that can be manipulated. There was a poll once, I was looking on my screen, I saw one of those news source polls, you know, an ABC or, you know, whatever poll, but it was a web-based poll. And I called a friend of mine who was in law school at the time, and I said, hey, there's a poll. And she said, no problem, hold on a second. And she actually stood up, she was in a computer lab at the time, and she said, hey, could everybody in here go to, and this was a local television channel, and this was in a different city, she was in a different city. She said, could everybody go to, and she yelled out the URL, and then she said, and go to the poll and vote for this candidate. And suddenly the vote totals went up like, 20 people, just like that. None of them could have voted in the race if they wanted to. So that's the kind of thing that you can manipulate, although it's an interesting indicator.
Two quick questions. What legislation has either Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama ever authored? And two, in this election for Hoosiers, is it going to be the gender, the color of the person's skin, or the policies which they represent, which will determine who wins the Democratic primary?
Well, that's interesting. For policies they have authored, I'll just refer you to their website. So no point in me getting into which, because then if I present something, someone's going to say, well, what about this thing that you're not talking about? And authored versus supported or sponsored are very important distinctions in the case of legislation. But as far as which variable will be the determining factor, that's a very interesting question, because she does much better among women than he does. And he does much better among African Americans than she does, but if you look at the total electorate, there are far more female voters than African American voters in total. For a lot of people, the question they are now asking is, since I'm so close with both of them, because really policy differences are not substantive. I mean, there are differences, but it's easy enough to say, yeah, they're pretty close. If you're not feeling passionate about the differences where they exist, you could say, yeah, they're about the same. And so suddenly it becomes a question of who can motivate their voters better. The Obama campaign is doing something that's a little dangerous in terms of campaigning, in that they are relying on African Americans and young people. And for those two categories, we're talking about categories that have not been real hardcore loyal voters. In other words, they haven't fully developed a habit of voting. And it's dangerous to rely on them. But if you look from state to state, you'll actually hear a lot of folks who watched what happened in those states say that Obama had a better field game, but he was relying on a less reliable source of voters, and that sort of made a difference.
The New York Times has actually had several articles about how the age group you're in, like if you're in the 18 to under 44, you vote more towards Obama. If you're above 45, you vote more for Clinton, and they say it's more of an age gap than a racial or gender or working class, it's more of an age gap.
Well, actually, I didn't bring up the other items, but age, there is a clear trend. The older you are, the more likely you are to vote for Clinton. Younger you are, more likely you are to vote for Obama. The more education you have achieved over your lifetime, the more likely you are to vote for Obama. The less, the more likely you are to vote for Clinton. So there are a number of factors in there. And when folks start saying it's this one over that one, that gets a little bit dangerous. I mean, it's really sort of all of them. I haven't looked over this way in a while.
Andy, it's a little off the topic here, but today on Diane Rehm, there was a big discussion of the Indiana Supreme Court voter ID issue. And I'll tell you, IPFW Library got called by the Supreme Court for our weighing in on where to find that early legislative history, and we answered that question for the Supreme Court of the United States.
Well done, Helmke Library.
They couldn't call the Indiana State Library for reasons that they chose not to disclose. But any issues there with this election? I'm afraid I really don't know the whole issue. I didn't get to hear all of the Diane Rehm show, but that was the focus this morning. If
Sure.
you're interested to go back and look it up.
To just quickly summarize for those who don't remember, when you vote in Indiana, you have to have a government-issued ID. It has to be issued either by the state of Indiana or the United States government. We won't accept any Michigan or Kentucky or anything like that. It's got to be Indiana or United States. It's got to have your photo on it. Your name on that ID has to conform, is the word in the code, with your name and voter registration file. It has to have an address on it and an expiration date that is more recent than the last general election. Okay? So, yeah, keep all that in mind. So for most folks, it's your driver's license. Take your driver's license, you're going to be fine. If you do not have a driver's license, you can actually get a state ID for free. That's how they avoided the argument that this was a poll tax now. A passport, military ID. In Allen County, the first year this law was in effect, we had a veteran show up, and veterans' IDs, veteran administration IDs, don't have an expiration date on them. And so the precinct workers called the election board. They said, oh, should we accept this or not? And of course, who wants to turn a vet away? And the vet said, look, it expires when I expire. And we all said, works for us. That's good enough. That's an expiration date. Go ahead and vote. So we actually, the administrative interpretation of law is now that that counts. And believe it or not, IU Bloomington recently added expiration dates to its IDs. So ours do not. Purdue's don't. Purdue actually changed its ID system recently, and to upgrade to add the expiration would have cost another $30,000. When they were upgrading it, they weren't thinking about the ID law, and so it was an after-the-fact thing, but they didn't want to plunk down 30 grand. So that's what the law says, and I can tell you for a fact, every election, I have encountered someone who's been disenfranchised by this. Now, they're usually very isolated cases, because you can always go get an ID, except here's the compounding factor. There was a guy who came in 2000, I think it was 6, but it might have been 7. He came in, he had moved here recently, hadn't lived here very long. He had basically no family any longer. His apartment was robbed, including his driver's license. And in order to go get a new driver's license, what do you need? Birth certificate or your old driver's license or all those things that were missing. And he was not going to be able to physically get to his hometown several states away in order to get the documentation to come back and get his new driver's license in time to show it to us so we could let him vote. Now that's one example. Each election there has been someone like that who's had some experience and been disenfranchised. One of the problems with the Supreme Court case is that they, quite frankly, didn't do a good job of showing here are the groups that have been disenfranchised. They only made vague references to groups that would be more likely disenfranchised by this, not actually disenfranchised. And so I think you can expect at some point in time a case to come up again. In fact, at least one Supreme Court justice said, give me more, give me a group, come back with some evidence that backs this up. So I don't think we're done yet.
I'm sorry, I do have a question about the address. If you're a student and you move around a lot, like I've moved 4 times in like 3 years, how does that work with if your driver's license doesn't match what your registered address?
Well, fortunately, the voter ID law, there are 2 things that you do in the state when you register to vote. One thing you do is you prove you live where you say you live. And you do that the moment you fill out your voter registration card. The voter ID law, as we're talking about it here, is to prove you are who you say you are. So when you show up to vote, the most important thing is the photo and the name conforming in the expiration date. Those are the central parts. If, for example, you've just gotten married and your name has changed perhaps, or your address has changed, or you're a student, you're moving around a lot, those are less important because the purpose of the ID is to prove you are you, not that you live at the address at which you're registered to vote. But when you go to register to vote, if you, for example, when you register to vote, if you do it by mail, they will ask you for some sort of proof, which could be your driver's license. If you provide a driver's license with a different address, that's not going to count. You have to show something that shows that is your address, like a utility bill or a government check sent to that particular address. But that's only when you're registering to vote and if you're registering to vote by mail.
Okay, fine.
Yes. Okay. One more question. Okay.
One of the peripheral discussions around the Supreme Court ruling was that because because this being viewed, this judgment, or this law was being viewed by some as affecting Democrats more heavily than it would affect Republicans, was that in states where there is a Democratic majority, they may enact laws that would be benefiting a Democratic base. I was wondering if you had thoughts on that, what form that might take.
As sort of a general statement, and we can always find exceptions to this, Democrats have traditionally been more in favor of a lack of legislation, of openness, of enfranchising as many folks as possible, although we can find pockets where that's not true and Democrats who don't think that's the case. Republicans have been more inclined to want to restrict things. But whenever you start talking about changing voter registration laws, even if you have in your mind, well, let's do it in a way that's going to limit Republicans or Democrats, you don't know what's going to come out the other end of the legislative process. And so it's a dangerous game to play to say, hey, Indiana's restricting Democrats, so let's pass a law that's going to restrict Republicans. And besides, you don't really know what that change would have to be. So it's a dangerous game and one that I doubt too many legislatures are going to want to play. Well, thank you all very much. It's been my pleasure.